Hi, this is Dina for Splitcoaststampers. In this tutorial, we'll use die cuts as a base for a dimensional mixed media panel, and we'll build up color and texture as we go. I've gone ahead and pre-cut my pieces. This is a die set from Spellbinders that I've cut from cold pressed watercolor paper, and it's got a lot of pieces that layer and some other pieces that tuck into the truck bed for a cute little seasonal design. And then I've embossed a watercolor panel for my background and another little partial banner using this stencil from A Colorful Life Designs. And I've got a link for that technique on the photo tutorial page. I'm going to assemble my die cuts here, and I'm going to assume that you may not be using this same set. So I'll share some tips for you as you decide on your card design. You'll want to use thicker cardstock or even chipboard like cereal boxes for your pieces. And any bit of texture that you can add to your pieces will really show up in the later steps of this technique. You can build texture by layering die cuts. You can use textured paper. I used a cold pressed watercolor paper here, which has a rough texture. Or you can use embossed papers or emboss your pieces with a scoring tool or a stencil or a folder. You can also add textures with modeling paste or gel medium or other texture pastes, or you can add embellishments to your pieces. And once you've seen the whole process here, all of this will make more sense. Also, I'm using white paper here, but if you happen to use colored paper, that will be fine too. You just might want to cover it with a layer of gesso before you continue with the painting steps. So here is my little truck all assembled with the Christmas tree in the back, and I'm ready to assemble my scene. I want a raised border on my base panel, so I'm going to use my scoring board to score a double line on each side from the back side of the panel, and that will give me a little raised frame. And I'll do that on the sides of my little banner piece too, which will become a little road on my card. I got excited and I glued the road down, but I'm going to use gel medium going forward. And this is a matte gel medium from Liquitex. It is great as a decoupage medium and as a glue, and it dries clear and matte and flexible, so you can be a little messy with it and still get away with that. I'm going to brush a layer of it onto my panel and set my truck in place, and then I'm going to use a flat brush to both coat the die cuts and press them down onto the card. So I'm being careful to get down into all the cracks and openings of the die cuts with my brush, sort of pouncing into every little area. And gel medium can kind of goop into corners, so make sure that you get all those little goopy spots out too by tapping in with your brush where you see those little spots of goop. Once you have everything covered, you can create some little brush strokes in the medium or other textures if you want, and then leave the panel to dry completely. For the next step, you will need some acrylic paint. I just picked a few colors of craft paint here, and I'm starting with a Payne's Gray. Whatever color you choose for your first color, it will be the base color that will remain as a shadow around your die cuts. So I wanted that to be my darkest color. You can make a different choice if you want to. Again, I want to work that paint into every little crevice of my design, down around every edge, and down into the details of the more intricate die cuts too. And just a note here, if you're not starting with a solid background and you've got some colored paper or embellishments that you want to cover up, you will want to add a layer of gesso to your panel before you start with the paint. And that can be black gesso or white gesso, whichever you have on hand. I'll let that dry completely before going on to the next layer of paint. With the following layers of paint, we're going to use a dry brushing technique, and this is where you'll begin to see the texture of the die cuts and whatever embellishments and other textures you've added to your panel or scene. For dry brushing, you're going to pull a small amount of paint away on your palette and brush it back and forth until it's very thin and almost dry, and then brush very lightly over your panel so you're just hitting the open and raised areas of the scene. And this does take a little practice, so don't be afraid to try it out on another surface to get the proper touch. The intent here is to start to build and create some highlights on the scene by lightly adding color everywhere there's some dimension or a raised area on our panel. And even if your card design isn't as detailed as something like this, you'll start to see that effect in this step, and even more so if there's more contrast between your paints than I have here, working blue on blue. I will let that color dry and then do the same thing with a color that contrasts a little bit more. And you can see that a little bit goes a long way here, so don't be afraid to go really lightly. And again, you just want these additional colors to hit the high points of the die cuts and the textures. You don't want them down in the cracks with your darkest color, or you'll lose that contrast. I went and grabbed just one more color here, which is a pale sagey green, and I just want to add that in a few places. This is a bonus tip for you here. If you have paint left over on your palette, don't waste it and wipe it away. I wet my brush and coated a couple of cardstock panels that I'll use on other projects. And I'm just going back and forth here with long strokes and blending the colors together with a little extra water. And this is a good chance to just be free and messy. And if it doesn't work out, it's just paper, and you were going to wipe that paint up anyway, so there's no loss. I added more water and splattered a little paint onto my panel while it was still a little bit wet. And because my splatters went beyond that panel, I added a few more to my truck panel so I could pretend like I meant to have those other ones there. For a final layer, I'm using white paint, and I will recommend white for your project too. You can see here how it's really picking up the texture of the paper in the background and those score lines around the edges. And I lost a bit of the stenciled texture on the base panel, so next time I'll use an embossing folder for that. Also, make sure to turn your panel around so your strokes hit at different angles. You do want the white paint to really highlight all the edges of your die cuts and embellishments in this step. So do everything you can to get all those highlights where they need to be. Here is my completed card. I really just left the panel as it was and adhered it to a base. And again, those dies are from Spellbinders in a set called Truckin' Through the Seasons. There really are so many possible outcomes for this technique, so I did a second card that is a lot more simple. And maybe I should have done this one first, but that truck set is just so fun. I embossed my base panel with a snowflake folder, and that has a lot more dimension on it. So I will recommend that for your background panel. Use an embossing folder. I then adhered a snowflake frame with gel medium, and that was die cut again from the same watercolor paper that I used before. I've got a darker pink paint here as my base layer. And after that, I did some dry brushing with a lighter pink. And then again with the white as the top layer. So here is a completely different card using the same basic steps for creating a base with die cuts and then building up layers of paint and using that dry brushing technique to accent the raised areas of the panel. You can keep it pretty simple, or you can add lots of dimension by layering up your dies and adding texture to your pieces. You plan your card with the dies and supplies you have, and you'll find what works best for you. Thank you so much for watching.